from the Mercy One studio.
Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Dr. Bud Marr, and we have with us this morning a special guest. Our regular host, Bo Bonner, is traveling today, so I've invited someone to be on the air, but I'm going to let him introduce himself. It's someone you all will be familiar with.
I hope you're familiar. If you are, that means you're a regular listener to the Man Up Show. This is Joe Stopulus from the Man Up Show, filling in for probably the third time, I believe, on this show. It's a pleasure and an honor to be asked back, sir.
Yeah, we had our epic crossovers. This is a little bit different because Bo and I were scrambling a bit this week. He, sadly had a loved one pass away. His wife's grandfather had some complications with COVID. So we last minute reached out to you, Joe. And I don't know, I always warn Bo, though, if he doesn't make the show and we have someone of your caliber on, he's got to be careful.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's a lot of people don't hire me for this reason. That's what I tell myself. I don't get asked because they might lose their job. So that's why I tell myself every day when I'm not asked to show that's probably the only reason I haven't been asked. So thank you for that.
Sure. Well, before we get to our underwriter for the show, I wanted to ask you, so when I last lived in Des Moines, I've recently moved back to town. You had Father Zach Kautsky as a co-host. Did I say the last name right? I feel like I just butchered
No, that was good. That was good.
Kautsky. Yeah. So how's it been flying solo?
So there's a few things. Let me I'll take you way back, the way back machine. There's some pros and cons to it. The pros are that I only manage one schedule now. I actually was just talking to this with Jimmy and Tony, that the ability to manage just my own schedule and not have to manage Father Zach's schedule and trying to figure out times. I mean, it was – so have you ever seen the understanding of how the NFL puts the schedule together, how difficult it is, all the different moving parts and stuff? It's like that every week trying to get Father Zach's schedule. So that was good. Now, the thing I lose is any sort of deep theological – treatise that I can do to anything. I have no theology. I took one theology class in college, and then the rest of it's just self-taught. I'm a Goodwill Hunting over here, trying to self-teach myself theology. So I lack the what Father Zach brought to the table.
Well, I feel like you're being humble there, but I know what you're saying, and I'm impressed by your self-taught theological acumen.
You can learn more.
Speaking of
you can get more in more in library fees and late fees than you can from anyway. That's whatever the Goodwill Hunting line is. I need to remember that one.
Well, speaking of acumen, as always, we're underwritten by some folks who have some great acumen, both I think theologically and especially medical expertise. By Mercy College of Health Sciences, there in the heart of downtown Des Moines. One great piece of Mercy College's approach, Joe, that we like to mention is that they do a year-round thing. So regardless of how busy you are, if you've got a family or another job, Mercy has a tri-semester schedule that fits a lot of different lifestyles. But you can find out more about all of that at mchs.edu.
But is there a chance I could take over your show for a second?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is I don't know what you have planned right now, but I'm going to ask you a question. So a buddy of mine actually reached out, and he was from Des Moines. He's a younger guy, but he's into the Catholic faith, and said, hey, I keep hearing about Mercy College of Health Sciences. And he actually texted me this 2 or 3 days ago. It was in reference to you. He heard that you had moved back here, and he's Mercy College of Health Sciences. He goes, what do they do? And I said, well, I kind of know, but I'm not super fluent in everything you do. I said it was, in my estimation, it's a Catholic college that teaches health sciences, so a lot of nursing degrees in the Catholic world. What am I missing?
Yeah, we do. A lot of nurses run through our programs, and that's a big part of what we do. Although sometimes in conversations at church or in the backyard, I'll hear people say like, oh, you work at the nursing school. And that's not quite exactly true. That's our history. But Mercy also has a variety of programs. So under the umbrella of allied health, we have radiation technology, paramedic, medical assisting. You can even do pre-med at the school. And, this last year has been challenging for a lot of institutions. I feel like the college was strategically prepared because we do a lot of online education. So, when COVID hit, we were sort of prepped for that sort of thing. And then one thing the flag that I like to wave is, we're the Catholic college in Des Moines. And that's a source of great pride, a big part of our mission.
That's good. So, do you have any idea percentage-wise? You're obviously the dean of admissions or something like that. Do you know percentage-wise what the makeup is?
You mean in terms of like religious breakdown?
No. As far as degrees given.
Okay. I want to say, I should be on top of this better.
You're new again. You're new again.
I know. I taught there, so it's a different will, but maybe 80 to 85% nursing. Okay. And then the other is like a smaller, like the radiation technology and the digital sonography, those are really competitive programs that will have like 100 applicants and admit a dozen.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yep. Well, on the show today, Joe, we wanted to talk about, in a show like The Uncommon Good, where you're talking about Catholic social teaching, it's pretty much impossible to avoid current events. And of course, this is a big week in our country. Bo and I always do our best not to get bogged down in partisan politics, which is a little bit different. It overlaps with Catholic social teaching, but there's some important distinctions there. But of course, a big day in our country. And so we want to talk today, Joe, about the American experiment. And what we mean by that is what's sort of the history of our founding. How does that influence the way that our country has viewed itself, whether or not we've lived up to it or not during different times. And then thinking at the end of the show about especially protecting the most vulnerable in our midst. And of course, this time of year, normally Catholics would be traveling to D.C. for the March for Life. And unfortunately, because of the circumstances, that's not going to be able to happen. And so on the show, though, we wanted to flag that important event and to say a few things about what energizes those who participate in that. So that's kind of the table today, folks. I think we've got some great things to share. You all get a break from Bo Bonner, and we've got Joe Stopulus with us, so a lot of great things in store. We'll be right back after these messages. Folks, if you'd like to get into contact with the show, we love to hear what you have, like your thoughts, your feelings. You can always contact us using the ZipWhip line, 515-223-1150. You can call or text. Let us know what you think about Bo playing hooky. You could grade Joe out and let us know how he compares to Mr. Bonner, but always feel free to contact us during the show or throughout the week using the ZipWhip line. 515-223-1150. We'll be right back.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and John Leonetti in the morning is provided by Five Sons Naturescapes. Five Sons Naturescapes is a Catholic veteran-owned family company providing premium outdoor landscaping, clean up and restore outdoor living space with retaining walls, privacy fencing, pergolas, paver sidewalks, and patios. Issues with soil settling and water around the foundation and yard? Five Sons Naturescapes can grade and install drainage tile to help. Five Sons Naturescapes online at fivesonsnaturescapes.com. Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Christ is the Answer with Father John Riccardo is provided by Confluence Brewing Company, brewed locally and featuring regular, seasonal, and limited release beers available at local stores, bars, and restaurants. Confluence Brewing Company at 1235 Thomas Beck Road, off the bike trail south of Grays Lake, and online at confluencebrewing.com. Confluence Brewing Company offers curbside service and would like to thank you for your support. Thank you, Confluence Brewing Company, for your support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Storm Alert Weather is provided by Divine Treasures. Divine Treasures is a Catholic book and gift store serving the Des Moines community for over 25 years. Their mission is to help Catholics know, love, and keep their faith in our Lord Jesus Christ and His Church. Divine Treasures is where you can find great Catholic books, beautiful Bibles, rosaries, jewelry, statues, and religious gifts for those memorable events in your life. Divine Treasures, 5701 Hickman Road, Des Moines, 515-255-5230. Thank you to Divine Treasures for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Hi, this is Father John Riccardo, and I want to thank Caldwell Parish Funeral Home and Crematory for underwriting Christ is the Answer. Losing a loved one, as we know, is never easy, and it can leave you feeling lost and even hopeless at times. But Caldwell Parish helps ease that burden by sincerely caring both about your loss and about your faith. Caldwell Parish Funeral Home and Crematory is Des Moines' only Catholic-owned and operated funeral home. Their number is 515-276-0551 or online at caldwellparish.com.
We're back, folks. This is Dr. Bud Marr. It's great to be with you
and
today.
Joe Stopulus. I don't know if I'm supposed to take Bo's spot and say my name, but this is Joe Stopulus.
Yeah, we got Joe Stopulus. Joe, mention your show again today.
It is the Man Up Show, 9 a.m., 9 p.m., Mondays, every Monday, and on the podcast, Man Up, Joe Stopulus.
So wherever Bo and I go wrong each week, folks, you can turn to Man Up and get the necessary corrections and directives. No, Joe, today, of course, a big day in our country. You know, we have some significant events that have happened lately. And I guess the phrase that I hear being tossed around today is the peaceful transfer of power. Now, when you hear that phrase, peaceful transfer of power, I think you're supposed to hear like birds chirping in the background and the sun shining, you know, and it's like, well, this is sort of what sets apart the United States or other democracies from places where maybe the way rulers are selected or where power is passed down might look differently. But I know, Joe, just talking to folks out in the streets, you know, in different contexts, that the election process and even the events of today have, you know, they've caused different feelings for different people. It might even be what you would say is like a stressful time for some of our listeners. And I think a lot of this, Joe, goes back to, democracy, you know, a lot of great things about it. And it's meant to be a process that gets around sort of like civil strife by the people collectively selecting leaders who will represent them. But the fact of the matter is, representation usually involves sort of like one side or one group having more power, maybe being more representative of a certain demographic. So what's meant to mitigate that, I think, Joe, and you know, you might be a better historian than I am for sure, is that America has been guided by a constitution, a Bill of Rights, right? And to me, like what a constitution represents is that there are ideas, principles, values that a leader, regardless of his political party or his personal background, is meant to respect. So you think about something like our country's founding principle of all people being created equal, endowed by their creator. So there we have some theology entering into the picture with inalienable rights that have to be upheld and respected. And so I don't know, Joe, any commentary on, for me, like regardless of a person, like I said there, like a politician's party or their own walk of life, maybe their own religious background, that's something that's inviolable, right? It's set in stone.
So, yeah, if you want to know my thoughts, I've got lots of thoughts. Lots of thoughts, bud.
Fire away.
Yeah, so, at the end of the day, this day, regardless of where you voted 2 months ago, who you voted for, and how you feel about who is taking office and who's leaving office today, regardless of any of that, we as Americans need to hold our head up high today, understanding that this day is so unique in the world, in the history of the world. If you take it back to 1776 when the revolution happened, and then in 1788 when we had the first president with George Washington, the peaceful transfer of power after his second term is the first time it's ever happened in the history of the world, quite frankly. If you look at democracies when our founding fathers were born, so if you go back to call it the 1730s or so, there were no other democracies, there were no other self-governments in the history of the world. There just weren't any in existence. You know, there were experiments with it on kind of smaller factions, I suppose, but nothing like what we tried. And so the uniqueness of the American experiment, this experiment in a representative republic self-government, is so unique. And I think that's something that, when we talk about civics, just teaching of civics, helping everyone in America to understand that this is something that can only last as long as we, the people, allow it to last. And a quote that my listeners have heard me say over and over again is from John Adams, who wrote the original Constitution, Massachusetts Constitution, which then was kind of the forebearer for the U.S. Constitution. And he wrote that our Constitution is this experiment in self-government. The Constitution we have is for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other. And that shows us the importance that our founding fathers had in a people who had together a view on God, a view on the common good, a view to understand that this isn't just about a winner-take-all, us versus each other. This is for a group collective to understand that we are to work together as Christians, as a moral people, and that's the only way this would work. And so when I look at today, and I think about, if you ever read, there's a lot of great books out there on Washington, but George Washington was the greatest general at the time. He beat the most powerful army with a ragtag group of uneducated farmers, quite frankly, people who had just no experience in military, and put it together. And through his strategy, which, again, if you want to learn about his military strategy, just unbelievably interesting stuff to see what he was doing to actually pull this off. He was clearly the front runner. He was basically appointed president at that point. And then after his second term, the people wanted him to continue to be president. And there's a reason we celebrate him so much. There's a reason we name everything after him. Is because he said, no, this is not what this government's about. It's not about me. And he relinquished, even though he didn't have to, power. He gave power up, and he didn't know who was going to get it. Obviously, the biggest election then was between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and they had vastly different views, just like Democrats and Republicans today, vastly different views of the power within the federal government. John Adams wanted to call Washington a king, more or less. He didn't want to use the word king, but he wanted to hold his title up and to give more reverence to the position of president, whereas Thomas Jefferson wanted no part of that. And you can see the factions at play early on, people being devastated. Thomas Jefferson being devastated the Federalists won, and then in the contentious election in 1800, when he won, the opposite happened. It's so interesting, and history repeats itself, but America today, even in today's world where we're today transitioning power, that's something that we as Americans have to hold our head up high, that we are able to do this. So we have been the standard bearer for all the other democracies, all these other experiments in self-government around the world, that we are the flag bearer. We're the ones who started that, and this day, regardless of what you feel about it, is a special day in America and around the world.
No, Joe, that's great stuff. And before moving on, I have to ask you, so you mentioned being self-taught in terms of theology. It sounds like you're sort of a history buff. Was that a minor in college?
No. So I actually, it's funny you say that. I hated history until about 5 years ago. I mean, just growing up, I was always, I kind of just didn't like reading history. I'm like, well, it already happened. I don't care about what happened in the past. I care about the future. I'm more worried about current events and what's happening going forward. And then as I realized, my gosh, if we don't study history, we're doomed to repeat it. And the more you study history, the more you realize, oh my gosh, this has already happened over. I mean, there's a reason when people talk about the fall of America possibly happening in the future, it's because they've studied history and seen every other major superpower in the world fall. And no, I would say in the last 5 years, I have taken a liking to history, a lot of U.S. history as well, specifically. But I'm eating it up right now.
Well, I mean, one thing that you pointed out in that last comment that just is so important to me is this question of virtue. And it's fascinating, Joe, because as someone like myself who's, done a lot of like biblical studies, in sacred scripture, when God establishes rule, it's usually not through democratic forms. So you think about Moses or the judges, or certainly like King David, this is not, properly speaking, something where, like we all went into an election booth and chose the leader. And Catholic political theologians, philosophers have pointed out that the church can exist in different contexts. We don't demand for the church to be faithful. It doesn't demand that we necessarily need a democratic form of governance. Although, for the reasons that you pointed out, Joe, you can understand why, this is a source of pride for Americans and, like something that a lot of people turn to as even a source of hope. And in the sense of like righting the ship, like if things have gone awry, like hopefully through the voting booth, we can make a difference and kind of like push things in the right direction. And yet I do think I wouldn't say shortcoming, but maybe like danger or temptation, Joe, is that when you talk about self-governance, I do think people, especially maybe non-Christians who don't have the same sort of like presuppositions that we do, you can begin to think that authority is something that's only granted from the people. Like a person doesn't have the right to rule unless we say that they do. And we know from the New Testament, for instance, that all authority derives from heaven. That doesn't mean we blindly follow each law that's instituted, but even during Roman rule, when things were pretty terrible for Christians, St. Paul instructed believers to pray for their emperor, to follow the laws of the land insofar as they didn't conflict with the law of God. But I think this idea, Joe, that like we sort of invest rulers with their authority, that can lead us to some dangerous places. And that's where, like you say, we need to come back to democracy, when you say only works when you have a virtuous people, because if you don't have that sort of like common virtue in a sense of the common good, what begins to happen is that we think that just because something is a law, that it's like this like legal absolutism. So like abortion's been green-lighted in our laws, and therefore like who am I to question it? I feel like I'm joining on here, but like the phrase that comes to mind for me, Joe, is several years back there was a Supreme Court ruling. I believe it was Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and Justice Kennedy was kind of grounding the right to abortion in earlier rulings that the Supreme Court had made. And he said that each American citizen has this right to define their own
meaning,
the meaning of their own existence. Yep. And that can lead to some really problematic places.
Yeah, 100%. And when people are becoming their own gods, it's usually not a good thing. And one of the other thoughts I had, and you touched on it there, is as a uniting of a country. People think, oh, this is the worst it's ever been. This is as bad as it gets. And I said, in the Civil War, we did kill like a third. I don't know what the numbers are, like a third of adult males. Just wiped off, right? So hundreds of thousands of people when our population wasn't that big. So it's been bad. I just finished last night a book on 1968, specifically the Apollo 8 mission, but it talked a lot about the Apollo 8 mission in regards to 1968 and just how tumultuous. I mean, we lost MLK, RFK, and we lost, all the protests, colleges. It was absurd. But at least in the Civil War, people still went to church on Sundays. And it still was a believing. People obviously had skewed beliefs, especially when it came to slavery and race relations and whatnot. There was a fundamental belief in God, though, that our purpose was to a higher calling. And in 1968, obviously the church was still very much, church attendance was still up. What scares me the most today is all of these things boiling up again. But now we've lost kind of that foundation of faith as a culture. And I don't know if you've read, and my listeners hear me talk about Robert Putnam all the time, but the book Bowling Alone, or the book Them, and just how so Them is by Ben Sass. So Ben's Ben Sass, senator from Nebraska, wrote a book called Them, and then Bowling Alone, he quotes a lot in there, but both of them talk about how we've now fractioned ourselves and don't even hang out with other people that aren't like ourselves. And today, in 2021, we have the ability to do that in a way that our founders could never even have dreamed of. And, Ben Sass uses the example of the Rotary Club a lot, and obviously the bowling alley by Robert Putnam, about how people used to congregate with other people who weren't like them. I use the example of my Rotary Club. In that club, there are Democrats, there are Republicans, there are atheists, there are devout Catholics and Christians, all different ilks. And guess what? We get together every Friday morning, and we are the people. We are just good, normal human beings trying to help each other in a civic way. And that's what's lacking from society today. And that's one of the things that scares me the most, is we kind of lost that foundation. And I always come back to, and this is where I was going to take along with what you were saying about how God has ordained leadership. One of the Babylon Bee is probably my favorite news source. I drink my Babylon Bee coffee mug every morning. And in it, they make every 4th of July, they just rip on these churches and these people who put America above God. And you see it all the time. You put, people put, they worship the flag, or he talks about people being baptized, on their 4th of July service in Texas, they baptized 100 people into the, United States of America or something like that, just making fun of it. But I think that's something that we as Christians, as Americans, need to hold, even as prideful as I am in this country. And I love the idea of America. I love what we have done for religious freedom, for the ability to worship. Because I look around the world and see that clearly that's not the case in a lot of places. And so it's easy to put America on a pedestal, but America's nothing in the grand scheme of things. What matters is God. And so having that having the right hierarchy is very important, because it gets dangerous sometimes when people, especially on days when they're being super patriotic, to put America above the church. It can't be ordered that way, because we're all dust and ashes, and it's all going to go away, and by the end it's all going to be done anyway. But what matters is our faith in God.
Yeah, I think about that phrase from the Gospels, and when Jesus proclaimed this, he was probably speaking on sort of an individualistic level, but it certainly applies to communities and countries, and that's seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added to you. But if you reverse that order, it can lead to some really terrible spots. And Joe, with what you were just saying, I'll be honest, like, one difficult thing about having a show like The Uncommon Good is when Bo and I talk about Catholic social teaching, it inevitably comes up like as a sort of measuring stick. So how is the Catholic Church in Des Moines, or how is the United States living up to this high call? And sometimes when you talk about those things, it can sound like, wow, Bud's really sort of down on the U.S. And that's never my intention. St. Thomas Aquinas says that patriotism is a natural virtue. So we should all seek the welfare of the city, of the country to which we're sent. And yet, Joe, as you point out, there are various points in our history. Slavery is a big one that stands out. We could talk about Jim Crow laws, maybe how much of our decision-making in recent years has been driven more by questions of, wealth acquisition rather than justice, all sorts of things. And those, whenever you get into the weeds there, like, there's debatable points that we don't have probably the full time to cover all of the nuance. But I think our calling as Catholics, Joe, is not only to seek the common good, but at times, insofar as possible, and this is where in the second half of the show we can get into a question like abortion, we are called to be prophets. And just in thinking about the show today, Joe, like, a few persons who stand out to me, like, certainly not perfect individuals by any means, but the kind of vocation that I have in mind would be someone like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, Cardinal George, and saying that list this week, of course, MLK sort of jumps out. And again, a flawed individual, but I think some important things to say. A lot of people focus on the I Have a Dream speech. I recently re-listened to his mountaintop speech, which he gave the night before he was assassinated. And in that speech, it's interesting, Joe, because he goes back to the Constitution. He goes back to the phrase that, America confesses that all men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights. And so he says, I'm not holding up to you a standard that's like outside of who you're supposed to be. Like, if I was talking to Soviet leaders, I would have a completely different message. But America, this is who you say you are. And what MLK on his best days was calling us to, I think, is to be better, to live more in conformity with who we claim to be.
I can't add anything to that. I mean, you nailed it. And I think that, to me, this is just my vision of America. As America was founded on an ideal that did not exist anywhere else in the world in 1776. And the ideal that all men were created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And ever since then, the 245 years since then, it's been our job to try to live out that ideal. And so, yeah, I mean, we can talk about slavery. Slavery was literally every other country in the world had slavery in 1776. It took U.S. About 100 years to blot it out, and eventually we did. Civil rights, clearly these struggles, women's suffrage, all these things were us, in my mind, trying to live up to that ideal. That ideal obviously didn't exist in 1776, but nor did it exist anywhere else in the world. And that's why I love America, is because we had this ideal that we held up to a high standard, especially when you study history and understand things like slavery. The country wouldn't ever have existed because the southern states would never have signed on to it without that. And so when you start to realize the minutia of the difficult decisions that took place and then pull back from the context of us trying to live out that ideal, that's what gives me hope in America, is that we are working at it. We are working. I mean, how many countries, Jim Crow laws to having a black president didn't take that long. I mean, civil rights was in the 60s. Obama happened in 2008. In the grand scheme of things, we went pretty fast. And that's why, again, I think when I look at America, the reason I love this country is the good that we've done for so many people. And that's why, again, especially when it comes to religious liberty, that's something that this country has been a forebearer of around the world. And that's why days like today are exciting, to show people around the world that what can be done.
Well, folks, we're up against a break. When we get back, we're going to pick up where Joe left off, thinking about what our country's been called to and how that plays out with defending the most vulnerable among us. We'll be right back. This is Bud Marr with Joe Stopulus on the Uncommon Good, Iowa Catholic Radio. Folks, we love, of course, when you tune in each week, but we want to connect with you in various ways throughout the week. You can do so. Check out all that Iowa Catholics Radio is doing by going to Twitter, for instance. On Twitter, we've got our handle at IA Catholic Radio. There's the old school website, which has all the information you need about upcoming events and what's on the air. That's at iowacatholicradio.com. And then finally, if you go to Facebook, you can just use the search bar to look for Iowa Catholic Radio, the Uncommon Good. Joe, does Man Up have a Facebook page?
We do. We have a Facebook page and a Twitter following. I will say it is not as robust as others. The podcast is the best way to stay up to date.
Yep, all the old podcasts and shows are up online as well, and you can find those by going to our Facebook pages and clicking on the links to the podcast. We'll be right back.
Thank you to Bozen the Florist for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio, Dowling Catholic Football, and Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo.
What better way to send a message to a friend or a loved one than a beautiful bouquet of fresh-cut flowers? Hey, this is Tom Bozen from Bozen the Florist. Our family business has been helping Central Iowans send messages locally and around the world for almost 100 years. Whatever the occasion, whatever the message, we can help you say more with Bozen. That's 244-ROSE, 244-7673, or visit us at bozen.com.
Thank you to Mercy One for their support of Iowa Catholic Radio. From the cardiovascular experts of the Iowa Heart Center to the pediatric services of Mercy Children's Hospital and Clinics, Mercy provides complete care for Central Iowa's adults and children with more than 50 primary care and specialty clinics in the Des Moines area. Find a convenient Mercy One location near you. Online at mercydesmoines.org.
At Golden Rule Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling, our number one rule is the Golden Rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. And there's no better time than now to be living it. This year has been one for the record books, and the hits just keep on coming. So at Golden Rule, we are doing what we can to help out yet again. Introducing our Golden Age Buyback Program. As your HVAC system reached the golden years of life, we will give you up to $1,500 to have it replaced. Everyone deserves the Golden Rule, and this is one way Golden Rule gives back to you. Go to goldenrulephc.com.
Here's your forecast on Iowa Catholic Radio. Following a warm front, things will be pretty mild today. Our afternoon high will be in the mid-40s, but that wind will be gusty, as high as 35 miles per hour occasionally, and we should have sunshine. Overnight looks clear with our low in the upper 20s. A sunny and breezy day coming up tomorrow, and a little bit cooler will stay in the upper 30s. Another shot of cold air coming in on Friday. Sunshine and our high only in the mid-20s. I'm meteorologist Steve Hamilton on Iowa Catholic Radio.
Welcome back, folks, to the Uncommon Good. Again, I'm Dr. Bud Marr. I'm normally the sidekick on the show. Today, I'd like to think I was captain, but I've got a great co-host with me, Joe Stopulus from the show Man Up. Thanks again for being back on.
Yep, Sideshow Bob. That's what I'm going to start calling you Sideshow Bob, I think. That works out well.
Do I have to grow the equivalent haircut?
You got to get the haircut. You got to get the haircut if it's going to stick.
I don't know. I'm going to have to invest in some Rogaine, I guess, because that's quite the – if you've ever seen The Simpsons, that's quite the do. Well, going from Sideshow Bob back to –
good luck.
The American Experience and MLK. Joe, at the end of the last segment, I mentioned that mountaintop speech. Jimmy says Sideshow Bud. He's behind that idea as well. I mentioned that mountaintop speech, and this one it's a really fascinating speech, Joe, because Martin Luther King Jr. gave this on the night before he was killed. And what stands out to me, I've shown this to students, is he seemed to have a real premonition that he was up against, his life was going to be cut short. And he says at one point in the speech, longevity is to be sought. Like any person, he desires a long life, but there are things that are more important than just extending your life indefinitely. And to me, Joe, the heart of the speech, and I think what really applies to what we're talking about today, is this one paragraph. And pardon me, listeners, I'm just going to read this paragraph because I think it's essential to what we have to say in the second half of the show. But as by way of context, there were certain injunctions passed in the American South to try to prevent MLK from advancing the civil rights movement at the time. And basically this was sort of like, look, you've got your cause, but we can't have you blocking bridges or assembling in the streets, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what King Jr. had to say. Now, about injunctions, we have an injunction, and we're going into court tomorrow morning to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction. All that we have to say to America is be true to what you've said on paper. If I lived in China or even in Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they hadn't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights. And so just as I say, we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around. We aren't going to let any injunction turn us around either. We're marching on. And Joe, I obviously can't deliver that with the same aplomb and rhetorical force that King himself did. But what I hear there is reminiscent of the Old Testament prophets, where King Jr., as a pastor, is reaching back to America's history and back to who it claimed to be at its foundation and saying, look, this is what you have on paper. This is what it says for Americans in the Constitution, for Catholics in their Bible. You know, how are we doing? How are we living up to who we claim to be? And you hear echoes of really Frederick Douglass, who says, you know, like your celebrations on the 4th of July, they sound different to free persons than they do to slaves. And that's not okay. And so neither one of these two was hating on America. They had stirring words about America as a country and its calling, but they did call us to live to a higher plane.
That got me really fired up. And that was even with your delivery. Which, again, I thought those words are just, they're stirring. And MLK is just, there's a reason we hold him in such high regard, obviously. And one of the things I reflect upon when we talk about just the uncommon good and we talk about the Catholic Church today and the Christian movement today and trying to regain the culture, Frederick Douglass, MLK, Lincoln, Washington, these great heroes of ours, these are the people who, these pillars of ours in society, they were fed, first and foremost, at church. These were men of faith. These are men of devout faith. And this came from the church, came from the pulpit. All these movements came from there. What worries me is what the future looks like. When we see movements in society today, they're not coming from the church. They're coming from some sort of civic organization. They're not coming from a place of a fear of God, first and foremost. And I think the reason, obviously, King was so successful, the reason he was able to do what he was able to do was because he, first and foremost, was fed by God, and he was, first and foremost, understanding of God's role and how this is more important than country, is God first. He understood that, and so did the people he was talking with, and he could unite it. My worry is that we lack a lot of that today. We lack a lot of just the fertile ground that we had at the time, and so I think that's our call as Catholic Christians is to help till the ground, till the soil, and get it back to the point where we are ready to receive these messages, and that our future leaders are open and being able to talk openly about the providence of God. And how that needs to be as Americans, the most important thing is our relationship with God, which King clearly understood in his writings. I'm all fired up now. That was really good.
Well, I know Bo, he sang like a dirge on your show once, or like some sort of sea shanty or something, which I could never pull off, but.
Yeah, and I won't ever do that. I will never forget that moment when Father Zach and I could not stop laughing. We couldn't stop laughing.
Folks, speaking of podcasts, you got to find this old episode, and maybe I can search it out for you and highlight it on Twitter for everyone who wants a truly entertaining experience. But more seriously, Joe, when you were talking there, what came to mind for me is sometimes on the show, Bo and I talk about how different important words can be used equivocally. That means with different meanings. And we do that not just to be nerds or to show to our parents that all their money wasn't wasted sending us to college, but it can sort of clear the playing field. And I think with this discussion, this is huge because you think about the term rights and human beings having rights. And as Christians, as Catholics, we say, of course, God created each human being in his own image. And therefore, they have these kind of rights that can't be violated. But I feel, Joe, like in our context, that term has gone off the rails a bit. And I think about the way that people use rights. And you know what? I'm just going to come out a little bit harder here, guns blazing. But especially, this month where we remember in a special way the pro-life cause and remember the anniversary of Roe v. Wade and what's taken place since that time. In conversations with students or with friends, I sometimes hear the term rights used in really unfortunate ways. And you think about something like even a Supreme Court ruling where the highest justices in the land said a woman has a right to privacy, which therefore undergirds the right to kill the child in her womb. And Joe, that's where as Catholics we have to seek to purify our language and as much as possible witness to true rights. And so, like, for instance, with this cause, we have to remind people that when someone says, like, I have a right to my own body, I can get an abortion if I want to, we have to remind them that there's not simply one body involved. There's two bodies. And that's not to downplay the difficulties that many women face in their pregnancies. That's not to downplay the ways that we maybe fall short as a society or community in supporting those women. But, Joe, I think really one cause that we can be prophetic about in our time is this question of abortion.
Yeah, it is. It's something that I've always been. I've always been on the side of life, clearly, and I've gotten to the point now where I'm so nauseated, quite frankly, by the support that I see out there now. In the 90s, it was a safe, legal, and rare, right? That was kind of the tagline for the pro-abortion movement. Understanding then that if it's safe and legal, okay, it's fine, but rare would have some sort of connotation that they don't want this, right? So if it was a good thing, if like eating your vegetables, you wouldn't say safe, legal, and rare because you want people to eat their vegetables because it's good. So safe, legal, and often. But you say rare because it's probably not something you want to have done. Well, why don't we want to have done? So that was the 90s, and as sad as that was, I would long for the days where people were at least open to the idea that we want rare, because now, there's literally a shout your abortion movement. There are people, Twitter's the cesspool of the world. I get that. I understand that we shouldn't be using Twitter to show an actual snapshot of America, but you'll see things of people putting, I just got an abortion, take a picture of themselves, put it on Facebook and Instagram, and it's demonic. It clearly is demonic. And that's where I think we as Christians need to get to this point where we're taking back the culture. Politics is downstream from culture. And so all of this stuff is flowing, this dirty garbage is flowing from a river up north of us, and it's bad. It's toxic culture that is pushing that this stuff is good, it's okay, it's a positive good. And it's gotten to the point now where I'm so sick of all of it that, yeah, as you can tell from my voice, I did a show, if your listeners want to. I get pretty high. It's probably the most heated I've ever been on my show. But back in October, I did a why I can't even vote pro-choice, and I made the connection between. And I stay out of politics completely on my show. I just try to avoid it like the plague. But it's gotten to the point now where the idea of if my candidate who I love, let's say there's a 100% Catholic candidate, this guy checks every Catholic box 100% of the time, good person, family person, all the et cetera, but they were pro-choice. I couldn't even do it. I've gotten to the point now that would be like them saying, hey, listen, I'm 100% Catholic 100% of the time, but I'm okay with slavery, even if I'm personally against slavery. Like, I would never own a slave, I would never have an abortion, but I'm okay with it. Like, I'm now to the point where I'm just. It's gotten so much for me because of how far the movement swung the other way. Now you have all these people talking about the positive good of abortion, and when you hear the stories and when you learn about what an abortion entails, how against God's nature that is. The most beautiful thing, obviously, we've had 5 kids now, and when you see the ultrasounds, when you hear the heartbeat, when you understand what this little tiny baby turns into, and to end that it's sickening. But the reason for hope, or the reason I think we need to take it back, is there's a few different things we need to do. This is the year of St. Joseph. I don't know if you guys talked about it in the show yet. Pope Francis has ordained this the year of St. Joseph. We need fathers.
Yeah.
The uncommon good. You talk about what we need for the common good is fathers. We need the family unit back. And this year of St. Joseph, if we want to stop the plague of abortion, if we want to encourage families, it starts with fathers. I go through the statistics ad nauseum of what. Of A, the stats in general today for lack of fathers, and then B, what that means to the kids. And that's what we need to do. We need to reclaim the family. And in doing that, that'll solve a lot of the problems with abortion. People will be less likely to want them if we've got a father in the house, if we've got stable incomes, et cetera, et cetera. I'm rambling. I'm hot. You got me all fired up now.
Well, in all seriousness, Joe, that's what I really do appreciate about your show, Man Up, and just this show specifically dedicated on Iowa Catholic Radio to calling Catholic men to be more faithful and to model themselves after St. Joseph. Because one thing that's really tough for me with this issue, I'll be honest, is that it's so heartbreaking and mind-boggling to think about what's taken place in our country since Roe v. Wade has been legalized. On the other hand, Joe, it's something that's really pushed to the margins, and you can go about your life. And I'm guilty of this as anyone, checking social media on your phone, watching Iowa State lose football games, vegging on just binge watching Netflix or whatever. And there's this great injustice that's around us, and you can kind of live this comfortable existence and out of sight, out of mind. And this, Joe, so if you know, like you and I are friends, you know me, I'm pretty non-confrontational. And in terms of like the show itself, Bo is like
I was going to say, your co-host is a little bit different.
He likes a good argument, to put it mildly. But Joe, I feel like this is one area in social life where we have to be brave, always with love and gentleness, but willing to make people uncomfortable. And that starts in our own life. Like, we have to ask ourselves, I think, to say, like, how heartbroken am I by this reality? Mother Teresa, St. Mother Teresa, she reminded us that if you can take a life in the womb, then we shouldn't be surprised by other forms of violence. And you want to think about like the coarsening of language and relationships in our culture. It starts with this kind of utilitarian perspective that if someone, doesn't measure up to a certain level of reason or whatever, they're discardable. I think, Pope Francis has done a great job talking about the throwaway culture. And that's characterized not only by abortion, but by how we treat the elderly, how we treat the poor, etc. But we have to have, Joe, I feel like our hearts broken personally, and that can begin with fasting for this cause, with marching for this cause. But sometimes I think uncomfortable conversations when the time is right.
I think you're 100% on, and I will give you a real-life example of this. It's my wife, Kristen, who you also know as not a very confrontational person. She has
schooled me on the soccer pitch, really embarrassed me.
She gets on the soccer pitch, and she likes – that's different, though. That's a sporting competition. A little different. Confrontations on the sporting fields are different than confrontations in real life. So – she is, extraordinarily kind and patient. And, if we're talking, so this is a perfect example. It's kind of the same thing with you and Bo. I'm going to tell you and Bo are like me and my wife. Okay, so he will welcome a conversation on economics and on political theories and all these things.
That's right.
My wife will check out of all of it. She has opinions. She has opinions on all these things. And if she's at a group, let's say there's a table of 8 of us, and she knows, I don't know, 1 or 2 of them. She could know all of them. She could know none of them. It does not matter. And nobody, they could talk politics all day and religion and all the things, and she'll opine when she feels like she needs to opine. If somebody brings up that they're for abortion or that abortion's a good or a positive good or anything like this at all, she will come out of her very nice, genteel shell and be very, very assertive to you and telling you why that's wrong. And so that's a good example of she's done. She's done with allowing people who have never been – first off, they probably have never been told. Maybe they've just never seen the other side of it. And that's another thing that we've got to understand as an evangelical church. We used to have to go to Africa to find people who've never heard the gospel. There are people in your neighborhood who have never heard the gospel. They've never understood what it is that we actually believe. And I believe that's the case with now the pro-life cause as well. People just don't – they're not – in my office, if somebody – I've had this happen. People have said, oh, yeah, I'm totally – and I'll just say, okay, good. And I'm not going to bash them over the face with it. But I am going to walk them through systematically why I believe that is a wrong decision. And we have to, as Christians, be armed similarly like we do with the gospel. St. Peter says we always have to be ready armed and ready to go to give our defense of the gospel. Same thing on things like this, on the life issue. We have to be able to articulate to people who otherwise maybe not have heard it and stand up, as you pointed out. If somebody wants to tell me about their tax policy and the way that they want to run the country with all, that's fine. I'm okay. I might opine, possibly, but if someone's going to talk about abortion in a positive good that abortion is for society, I am going to confront that. I don't know if I'm going to change their mind, but I'm going to do it in a tactful manner as best as possible and explain to them why I think that's not the case. So I think you're right on as far as how we as Christians need to stand up to this and start to change the tide in the culture.
Well, and I know we just have a few minutes left, but I feel like I have to give sort of a unfun warning. This is not a rosy message to hear too early in the morning, but Joe, and feel free to qualify what I have to say here. I feel like we're coming up against a time where to take a stand on behalf of life, both life in the womb, the lives of the disabled, the lives of the elderly. The temperature is going to be turned up on Catholics. And what I have in mind, I want to kind of avoid the weeds of what we're passing through right now, but I do think you see this kind of idea that if you vote a certain way or if you hold certain principles, then you're sort of a threat to peace. And I think this gets employed against Catholics in certain ways. So I just want to say, to our listeners, be absolutely rooted in prayer and in the study of God, and, ask for graces each day to love well, but also to speak the truth clearly and the truth lovingly. I don't know. No, I think you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, so I will say we listen to a lot of saint stories in the car with the kids, the glory stories, and we listen to them all the time. And one of them is on Jose Sanchez del Rio, from the Cristero movement in the early 1900s. And I used to listen to these as history, as these were things that happened in the past. Starting now in January, during Exodus 90, I tend to read at least one or two books on the gulags, on the concentration camps. And I used to read this through the lens of, well, this is things that happened in the past in other countries, in faraway lands that are, these are now I'm looking as models of things that might actually happen here. Jose Sanchez del Rio and all the Cristeros, they stood up for their faith. They were kicked out of church. They did not care. There's underground churches. They received Eucharist, and they stood up, dying, saying, "Viva Cristo Rey." That is something that God forbid, I sure hope doesn't happen in our country. But you can see with the cancel culture becoming more pervasive and the Catholic Church holding to traditional values on things like life, you could see where this might happen. And so to your point, your suggestion was we've got to be rooted in prayer. We've got to be ready to go. I agree 100%. My wife and I have, now when we're talking about the kids, we're saying, listen, I never thought of martyrdom, whether it's white or red, as far as my life in America, our quiet, cozy life in America. But you can see that 70 years from now, my kids will in their 70s. This is clearly could be the case. And so we're preparing them for that. We understand that. But regardless of that, it's our call as Christians, as Catholics, to wake up every morning, get on our knees, and figure out what the Lord's call is in our life. What are we called to? Well, we're called to develop a relationship with Him, a fear of God, a healthy fear of God, and also to develop prudence. I pray every day for prudence. I pray that I may have the wisdom to know what it is that I'm supposed to do, and then have the fortitude to go along with it. So I just think all of these things, as the pressure, as you said, the temperature gets turned up, that's just more for us to go back and sharpen our swords even more in prayer. And then we'll know, through prayer, through fasting, we'll know what God's call is for us. But that is incumbent upon us to do that.
Well, that's a great word to end on, Joe. I don't have too much to add. We're called to be salt and light in every era. In the very near future, I think our saltiness will stand out even more. So let's continue to pray, folks, that Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, may reign in our hearts, in our communities, in our city, our country. As Bo says, the entire galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. We'll be back with you on the Uncommon Good next week. With this call to be grounded in prayer, we encourage you to schedule your prayer life using Iowa Catholic Radio. We pray the Rosary together daily on air at 5:30 a.m., 9:30 a.m., and 9:30 p.m. You can also always pray the Rosary 24/7, 365 using the Iowa Catholic Radio app. And then finally, one other prayer opportunity I want to highlight is the Angelus each morning at 6 a.m. We mentioned earlier using Iowa Catholic's Twitter handle, Facebook, website to stay connected. You can find out about all Iowa Catholic Radio events at iowacatholicradio.com. And then, folks, we always like to end the show with a reminder that this is a ministry, and you hear the voices on air, but all of us are involved in this important ministry. And so any way you can plug in through your prayers, certainly through your financial contributions, as Mother Angelica used to say, please remember us in between the electric and the cable bill. And then we wanted to highlight with that reminder about helping us out financially, the Iowa Catholic Radio Carathon, which will begin Monday, February 22nd. So your support helps keep Iowa Catholic Radio on air. We encourage you to think about that throughout the year, but especially during the Carathon, the week of February 22nd, if you would consider a $30 monthly gift or some other contribution. If you need to learn more, you can call 515-223-1150. But we do thank you for your prayers and for your financial support. Joe.
Yes.
This was a blessing, buddy. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad we could do it.
I was taking notes as you were talking about history.
I'm glad. Thanks for the call. I tell you, you guys are in no jeopardy of me taking your jobs, so you're good to go.
Folks, we do appreciate it. This is the Uncommon Good, Dr. Bud Marr with Joe Stopulus. Bo Bonner will be back with us next week. We will see you then.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.